Can we trust our own memory? Have you ever wondered whether your brain might be lying to you? And not intentionally, and not because of some illness, but simply because this is how human memory works. Almost every one of us has been absolutely certain about something at least once in our lives, so certain that we would be ready to argue about it. We remembered a specific phrase, a logo, a scene from a movie, or even a historical event, but later it turned out that we were wrong. At first glance, there is nothing unusual about this. People forget information, mix up dates, and can remember a name or a title incorrectly. But there is a phenomenon that goes far beyond ordinary forgetfulness. Imagine that not one person, not 10, and not even 100, but millions of people around the world remember the same thing that never actually happened. This phenomenon is known as the Mandela effect. It received its name thanks to researcher Fiona Broome. In 2009, she was talking with other conference participants and mentioned the death of Nelson Mandela. She was absolutely convinced that he had died back in the 1980s while he was still in prison. Moreover, she remembered television reports, memorial speeches, and people's reactions. But when the people she was speaking with told her that this was not true, she was shocked. In reality, Nelson Mandela not only left prison, but also became the president of South Africa. He died only in 2013. At first, it seemed like it could simply be an ordinary memory mistake. But soon, Fiona discovered that thousands of other people had made the same mistake. All of them were convinced that they remembered an event that had never happened. That was the moment when the term Mandela effect was born. And although the story about Nelson Mandela is the most famous example, there are actually hundreds of similar cases. Now we are going to test how well your memory works. Do not search for the answers online. Just answer in your mind. What does the Volkswagen logo look like? If you are imagining large letters V and W touching each other, you are not alone. A huge number of people remember it exactly this way. But if you look carefully at the real logo, there has always been a thin gap between the letters. It has existed for decades. However, the brains of many people seem to erase this small detail. Why does this happen? Because the human brain loves simple shapes. A single solid symbol is easier to perceive than two separate letters, so memory automatically simplifies it. The next example. Everyone knows the character from the board game Monopoly, an elderly, wealthy man wearing a top hat. Now answer honestly, did he have a monocle? If you answered yes, you are once again part of the majority. But here is what is interesting. This character has never had a monocle. So where did this confidence come from? Psychologists believe that the brain simply combined two familiar images. A wealthy gentleman wearing a top hat is strongly associated with a monocle. In addition, there is another famous character, Mr. Peanut, who really does wear a monocle. Over time, these images blend together, and a person begins to sincerely believe in a detail that never existed. Let's continue. Remember Pikachu. Do not rush. Close your eyes and imagine his tail. Many people will say that the tip of his tail is black, but that is not true. Pikachu has a yellow tail with a brown base, but there is no black tip. Why does the brain add this detail? Because it seems logical. Pikachu's ears have black tips, and the brain automatically transfers this pattern onto the tail. Another example. Do you remember the robot C-3PO from Star Wars? Most people will answer that he is completely golden, but look carefully at the scenes from the movies. One of his legs is silver. This detail was present almost all the time, but most viewers simply did not notice it. Our brain remembered the overall impression, a golden robot, and removed everything that did not fit into this simple image. Examples like these may seem insignificant, but they demonstrate one important feature. Our brain does not record reality like a video camera. It collects only separate fragments, and then it builds the picture itself. That is why we can sometimes be completely sincere and absolutely certain about things that never existed. Examples that will make you doubt your own memory. So, we have already discovered that memory is not a perfect storage system for information. But the most interesting part begins when not just individual people make mistakes, but huge groups of people do. Now we will look at some of the most famous examples of the Mandela effect and try to understand why they happen. Let's begin with one of the most famous cases. Many people are convinced that Darth Vader said the famous phrase in the movie Star Wars, "Luke, I am your father." This quote can be heard in movies, television shows, advertisements, and parodies. It has become part of popular culture. But if you watch the actual movie scene, you will hear something different. Darth Vader says, "No, I am your father." The word Luke is not spoken in that scene. So why does everyone remember it this way? Because outside of the context, the short phrase, "I am your father," sounds unclear. People began adding Luke's name so that it would immediately be obvious which scene they were talking about. Over time, this changed version became more popular than the original. Now remember the song by Queen, "We Are the Champions." Many people are ready to sing the final words of the world, and it really does sound familiar. But if you play the studio version of the song, it ends differently. The words "of the world" appear in other parts of the song, but not at the very end of the studio recording. It was live performances and countless covers that strengthened this alternative version in people's memories. The next example is connected to cartoons. What is the correct name of the adventures of Bugs Bunny? Looney Tunes or Looney Tunes? Most people choose the second option because the word tunes seems logical, a shortened form of cartoons. However, the correct name is Looney Tunes. The series was originally connected specifically with music, which is why the word tunes was used, meaning melodies. It is interesting that the Mandela effect is not limited only to logos or characters. It affects even historical events. For example, after the death of famous people, there are often messages from individuals who are convinced that this person had already died many years earlier. This phenomenon is explained by the fact that the brain mixes together different news reports, rumors, or information about serious illnesses with the actual event of death. Why do some examples of the Mandela effect become so popular? Because they create strong emotions. When a person suddenly discovers that they have remembered something incorrectly their entire life, they experience surprise. And emotions are exactly what make us share information with others. Social networks only strengthen this process. One user publishes an unusual example, others begin checking their own memory, and then they tell their friends about it. This creates a real chain of information. That is why videos about the Mandela effect regularly receive millions of views. People want to test themselves. They want to understand whether they are the only ones who were wrong, or whether this is truly a phenomenon that affects everyone. But the most important question remains unanswered. How is it possible that the brain can create memories that are so convincing? Why do we not feel that we are mistaken? And can we intentionally create a memory in a person about an event that never happened? The brain that rewrites reality. We have already seen dozens of examples where people all around the world remember things incorrectly. Logos, movie quotes, images of famous characters. But the main question remains, why is this even possible? The answer lies in the fact that the human brain was never designed to perfectly preserve the past. In reality, memory is much more like a story that we constantly retell. And every time we remember it, it can slightly change. How does memory actually work? Imagine that you are reading a book. Then you close it. Several years later, you try to explain the story to a friend. You remember the main events, the main characters, the general meaning. But you probably will not be able to reproduce every sentence word for word. Your brain takes the main fragments and creates a new version of the story. This is exactly how our memories work. The brain does not store a complete copy of an event. It stores separate details, emotions, images, sounds, important moments. And when we need to remember something, it puts these pieces together, sometimes correctly, and sometimes it adds details that seem logical. Psychologists call this process memory reconstruction. The word reconstruction means that we do not simply retrieve a memory from storage, we rebuild it. And it is during this rebuilding process that mistakes can appear. For example, imagine that you saw a person wearing a red jacket. Several years later, you remember this situation, but before that, you saw a photograph of another person wearing a blue jacket. The brain may combine these two images, and after some time, you may be absolutely certain. I clearly remember that the jacket was blue. Even though that is not true, this does not mean that the person is lying. They really do remember it that way. Their memory has simply changed. One of the most famous researchers of memory became the American psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. For decades, she studied how easily human memories can be changed. In one of her famous experiments, participants were shown a video of a car accident. Afterward, people were asked a simple question, but the wording of the question was different. One group was asked, "At what speed were the cars traveling when they collided?" Another group was asked, "At what speed were the cars traveling when they smashed into each other?" And the third group, "At what speed were the cars traveling when they crashed?" It seemed like the difference was only one word, but the result was unexpected. People who heard the word crashed were more likely to estimate a higher speed, and some even remembered broken glass on the road. The problem? There was no glass in the video. The brain created a detail that matched the way the question was asked. The most famous experiment by Loftus was called Lost in the Mall. Researchers told people stories about their childhood. Among true memories, they added one fictional memory. For example, when you were 5 years old, you got lost in a large shopping mall. At first, participants answered, "I don't remember anything like that." But after several conversations, some people began creating details. They remembered what the store looked like, who helped them, what they felt. But that event had never happened. Their brain had created a complete memory. One of the biggest mistakes people make is thinking, "If I remember it very clearly, then it must be true." But the strength of a memory does not always mean its accuracy. On the contrary, sometimes the most emotional memories can be the most vulnerable to changes. For example, people often remember frightening events very vividly, but even these memories can contain inaccuracies. The brain tries to create an understandable story. It is not important for it to preserve every tiny detail. It is important for it to create meaning. Perhaps the most fascinating discovery is not that we can make mistakes, it is that we almost never feel these mistakes. When we remember something incorrectly, the brain does not show us a warning. Attention, this memory may be inaccurate. On the contrary, it gives us a feeling of confidence. That is why people can argue for years about something that never existed. But if memory can change so easily, what does this mean for our past? Can we trust childhood memories? Can we completely rely on eyewitness statements? And why have innocent people sometimes become suspects because of memory errors. We are used to thinking that memory is our main proof of the past. If we saw something with our own eyes, we believe that we know the truth. If someone says, "I was there, I saw it, I remember it exactly," it seems like that should be enough. But science shows a completely different picture. Human memory can be extremely convincing, and at the same time, completely wrong. Sometimes it is just a funny mistake with a logo or a movie quote, but sometimes an incorrect memory can change someone's life. Imagine a situation: you become a witness to a robbery. Everything happens quickly. You see a person. You remember the face. You call the police. A few days later, you are shown photographs of suspects. You look at them and say, "That's him." You are certain, but the problem is that your memory has already changed. Maybe you only saw a part of the face. Maybe it was dark. Maybe you were frightened. The brain did not store the complete picture. It created the most likely version, and you can sincerely believe in it. During stressful situations, the brain works differently. When a person experiences danger, their attention becomes narrower. This is called the weapon focus effect. For example, if during a crime a person sees a knife or a gun, the brain may focus specifically on that object. Other details, the criminal's face, clothing, height, may be remembered worse. A person remembers the threat, not the entire scene. Because of memory errors, there have been cases around the world where people were punished for crimes they did not commit. This especially happened in cases where eyewitness testimony was the main evidence. A person could be completely certain, "I identified this person." But later it turned out that their memory had failed them. That is why modern legal systems increasingly take into account the fact that human memory is not a perfect recording of events. Can the brain be forced to believe in something fictional? Psychologists have studied this question for decades. And the answer may surprise you: yes. The brain can be convinced to accept false information. But this does not mean that people are easy to deceive. The process is more complicated. Certain conditions are needed: repetition, trust in the source, emotional impact, and the presence of gaps in memory. If a person does not remember a certain moment, the brain has a blank space. And then it becomes especially easy for new information to fill that space. In the past, spreading false information required years. Today, one video can be enough. Someone writes, "Do you also remember this logo?" Thousands of people answer, "Yes." And something interesting happens. People do not simply start remembering. They begin strengthening a shared version of memory. Every new comment becomes another confirmation, and after some time, the false version begins to seem obvious. There is an interesting psychological reason behind this. The Mandela effect affects our sense of reality. When we realize that we were wrong about something small, it creates a strong emotional reaction. We think, "How could I not have known this?" And then curiosity appears. If I was wrong about that, what else could I be wrong about? This very thought makes people spend hours watching videos, reading discussions, and searching for new examples. The Mandela effect does not mean that our brain is bad. On the contrary, it shows how incredibly complex our consciousness is. The brain constantly tries to create a complete picture of the world. It fills in gaps, it searches for patterns, it creates meaning. And most of the time, this helps us live. But sometimes this mechanism creates illusions. However, one more question remains. If our brain can change memories, are there other explanations for the Mandela effect? Why are some people convinced that they remember a different version of reality? This is where the most interesting theories begin. Parallel universes, changes in timelines, experiments with reality, and even the idea that we live in a kind of matrix. Parallel universes or just a brain error? We already know that the human brain is capable of creating false memories, but there is one detail that makes many people question everything. Why does it sometimes happen not to just one person? Why do thousands or even millions of people remember the same detail? This is where the most fascinating theories begin. Some of them sound so incredible that they have become part of modern culture. One of the most popular ideas asks, what if we are not mistaken? What if we are actually remembering another version of reality? According to this theory, there are many parallel universes. In each of them, events may develop slightly differently. In one universe, a logo may have a certain detail. In another, it may not exist. In one universe, a movie quote sounds one way. In another, differently. And people experiencing the Mandela effect supposedly carry memories from another version of reality. It sounds unbelievable, and that is exactly why this idea became so popular. But it is important to understand, there is currently no scientific evidence that the Mandela effect is connected to transitions between realities. The idea of parallel universes exists in physics as a theoretical concept, but it does not prove that our false memories are evidence of such transitions. The simulation theory. Another popular explanation is connected with the idea that our reality could be a simulation. Supporters of this idea say, if the universe is a giant computer system, then the Mandela effect could be a kind of glitch, as if the program changed small details, but some people still remember the old version. This idea became popular thanks to movies, books, and science fiction. It is interesting to think about, but the problem is the same. There is no evidence that reality works this way. CERN and reality changes. A separate wave of theories appeared around CERN, the European Organization for Nuclear Research. Some people on the internet claimed that after the launch of the Large Hadron Collider, details in the world began changing. Logos, phrases, historical facts. They suggested that particle experiments could have affected the very structure of reality, but there is no scientific confirmation of this. The Large Hadron Collider studies fundamental particles and the laws of physics. There is no evidence that its operation changes history or creates new versions of the past. Why are fantastic explanations so attractive? There is an interesting psychological reason. The human brain does not like randomness. When something strange happens, we search for an explanation. For example, you accidentally meet an old friend after many years. You can say, "What a coincidence," or you can think, "This is a sign." The brain constantly searches for connections. This is a very useful ability. It is thanks to this ability that we learn to recognize danger, make predictions, and find patterns. But sometimes the same ability makes us see patterns where there are none. Think about it. Every day your brain hides a huge amount of information from you. For example, you do not notice your own nose in your field of vision. You do not constantly feel your clothes touching your body. You do not analyze every sound around you. The brain filters information so that you can function normally. It creates a simplified model of the world, and sometimes this model is slightly different from reality. The Mandela effect is just one example of this process. We began this video with a simple question. Can we trust our memory? After everything we have learned, the answer may seem a little frightening. No, our memory is not perfect. We often think of memory as a storage system, as if inside our head there is a huge, hard drive where our entire life is saved. But nature created memory for a completely different purpose. Its main goal is not to preserve the past. Its goal is to help us survive in the future. The brain does not need to remember every second of yesterday. It needs to know what was dangerous, what brought benefits, who can be trusted, which decisions helped us survive. That is why it keeps what is important and removes what is unnecessary. The only problem is that sometimes it removes the wrong things. Perhaps the main lesson is not that our memory is weak. It is that we should be a little more humble in our confidence. We can be wrong, and that is normal. Being human means constantly creating our own version of the world. Before we finish this video, remember one moment. Is there something you were absolutely certain about, but later discovered that everything was different? Maybe it was a movie quote, a logo, a childhood memory. Now think, how many other things in our memory might be slightly different from what we believe? The Mandela effect does not prove that we live in a parallel universe. It does not prove that reality has broken. And it does not mean that our brain works incorrectly. It shows something much more interesting. The reality we see passes through the most complex device known in the universe, the human brain. Sometimes this device makes mistakes, but thanks to it, we are able to wonder, explore, and ask questions. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not somewhere far away in space. Perhaps it has been inside us all this time, in our memory, in our consciousness, in the way we create our own version of reality. And now write in the comments, which example of the Mandela effect surprised you the most? And the most important question, do you trust your memory after watching this video?